Before we dive right into this presentation, I need one moment of your attention, okay? I'm going to show you pictures of three people. Pick any one from them. You're one of these three people. For the next 5 minutes of the talk, I want you to imagine you're dressed like them and your headphones cannot stay on your head. Okay? So I need you to wear your headphones in such a way that it fits the headdress you're wearing. Can you do it, please? Yes. Pick one of these. No, if you have to wear your headphones, you have to be able to hear me. But it should not be fit on your head based on the person you pick. Maybe you can put it over the back, over the front. Yeah? Does that back work? Okay, so you have to be able to still hear me. That is the important thing. You can try out the front as well. Okay, for just 5 minutes, then we can proceed. We're going to talk about inclusive design. I'll arrive at the definition in a moment, but I want to start off with what the problem is. Before we dive in, I'm Faiz Malkani. I'm a Google expert for design. I lead design at FAQ Inc. We're a small early stage startup. And I'm also doing my bachelor's in computer science. Recently, we've been talking a lot about diversity in our workspaces. In the past couple of years, I've seen this entire movement become really huge, where people are talking more and more about bringing people of different races and genders and making them feel more included in our workspaces. And it's been going really great so far. We aren't at a target level yet, but we have made progress. The number of women and underrepresented minorities have increased in our workspaces. But does it stop there? Is that all that is there to diversity? The answer is very resounding no. We need to expand this ideology that we have that diversity is important. We need to expand that into our products. We need to think that the apps we build, the software we ship, it isn't very accessible and usable to all kinds of users. Let me give you a few quick examples. How many times have you had an experience where your hands are full of shopping bags and you're trying to open a door that has a doorknob? Pretty common to most of us. What do you try? You put a couple of bags down, right? And then you try opening the door. Or you try balancing them all in one hand and then try opening the door, right? That shows that doorknobs aren't a very inclusive experience. Because it's not just about disabled people, it's about your situation at that moment. If your hands are full, you're not in a perfect state. And because of that, you can't open a doorknob like a normal person would. So we need to expand the ideology of a diverse environment where all types of users are welcome and apply that to our products and our software. Currently, we and most product teams have spoken to do this. We come up with a persona of our target audience. Like say you're an e-commerce app. The persona that you come up with is maybe a young person who loves shopping, perhaps really into fashion or electronics and shopping. Okay, you can put your headphones back now. If you tried putting the headphones at the back or on the front, you can just wear them normally again. Was it an inconvenience? Yes? So if you try putting it in the front, it's going to fall off. Yeah, that was the first slide. We spoke about if you're wearing a headset for your religion or for the environment that you live in, it's not going to be very easy to wear earphones because they're designed for someone who doesn't have anything on their head. So you have to come up with alternatives, like putting it at the back or the front. And that is a huge inconvenience because it's going to either fall off or obstruct your vision. So right now I come up with these personas, right? And we design for that persona. Now that persona does represent our target audience, and that really works. But does it represent our entire audience? It does not, because our audience is definitely going to include things like left-handed people, colorblind people, people who aren't very familiar with technology, people who don't have the best of data connectivity, people who are new to technology and they don't understand design patterns that we are familiar with. Your users are going to include such people. But are you designing for these type of people? Or are you only designing for that ideal persona that you come up with? A few examples. Uh, India is 1/6 of the or 1/7 of the world's entire population. And in the past couple of years, so many people have come online because of cheaper devices and more available networks. And a lot of these users are using smartphones for the first time. And if you present them with an app that is really simple to use, everything is very basic, but everything is in a navigation drawer or a floating action button, that seems obvious to us, but it's not obvious to them. It's their first experience with technology. They don't understand software patterns like we do because we have spent years working with them. If your app is being used outdoors, most of us, when we build our apps as developers and designers, we tend to test them and build them in office environments. Environments where data connectivity is really great because you're connected to Wi-Fi, and environments where lighting is perfect because you have the fluorescent lighting in the office. But if your app is going to be used outdoors, that is almost never the condition. First of all, they're probably not going to have the best of connectivity. Second, lighting might be too intense because either sunlight or overhead lights, or the lighting might be bad. And third, the size of things. Now imagine if you're trying to sit in a chair and you're trying to use an app, right? And it has tiny buttons. You're probably going to be able to press them much easier than you would be able to if you were walking down the street and trying to press the same buttons. There are people around you when you're trying to do that. Your hand is shaking, the phone is shaking, and you're trying to get to those tiny buttons, which would work in an office environment, but it breaks down when you go out. When you grow old, some things that seem very possible to us at such ages are extremely difficult to older people. From simple things like performing a swipe gesture because motor functions aren't the best, to being able to click on a button because of its size, because they aren't physically capable of touching small buttons. Users of low-end devices. Most of us saw the Google I/O keynote in 2014, where material design was launched, and there was this really amazing music player that was demonstrated. And a lot of us fell in love with that design at that moment because it had fantastic animations all throughout. But if your user is going to be someone who has a low-end device and limited RAM and processor functions, those animations are going to be bad for them rather than provide a positive experience. Not only is it not going to work as intended, but it's also going to slow down the functioning of the device. Okay, so throughout the morning, I've been talking to a few random people about what they think this fruit or vegetable is. Any guesses? Okay, so here's the three most common responses I've got: olives, jalapenos, or gooseberries. Does anyone else have any other ideas? Gooseberries? Okay, yeah, that's one of the most common suggestions. You'd be really surprised. I mean, there are a lot of, I think only 2 people out of maybe 30 people that I spoke to actually had the correct answer. They're tomatoes. And it might seem very obvious if you look at this picture, but 10% of the population is colorblind. And if you're an app that has 1 million users, that's 100,000 users not being able to differentiate between basic colors in your product. It seems like a really small number, but when you scale it up, that 10% is a significant audience, and we aren't taking that into consideration when we design. What we're doing right now is called some UX. We call it user experience design, but that's wrong because not all users are experiencing that design that we intend. Only some subset of that users are experiencing the design that we want them to. And the acronym for that is SUX. It sucks. This is where inclusive design comes in. Uh, Disability in humans. By nature, we tend to think of it as a negative thing, or someone is disabled because they can't perform certain actions. But rather than being a negative thing, disabilities are just different. What things can people do is different from what the environment allows them to do. Inclusive design aims to solve this entire problem of how we design products for humans by empowering us to think in a way that normal people think, and by letting us know that not all users are represented by our ideal user. At this point, you're probably thinking inclusive design is just accessibility. And that is a very common point that people come up with. That you're just so far, you're just talking about things that can be fixed with adding accessibility support to the app. Another thing is people think it's universal design. Both of those assumptions are wrong because while accessibility is the means, inclusive design is the end. For example, say tomorrow you start designing a product that is really simple to use for a person who has one hand. That is your design for accessibility. But because accessibility is a part of inclusive design, your product ends up being helpful to people who have injuries in an arm, new parents. These are situational disabilities. They aren't natural disabilities. But inclusive design allows you and helps you to design for all these types of users. So one of the most important ways to approach this design philosophy is people first. Okay? The important thing here is people and not person. One of the most common phrases in design is design for the user and all else will follow. It educates us that if we design with a person in mind, a human being in mind, our design is going to be really great. But that kind of breaks down because that one person cannot represent the entire human population. Things change. People are unique. Everyone has their own disabilities or abilities. A people first approach allows you to think of everyone and not one person. Think of in all ways that humans can be different, they can be unique, they can have different disabilities and abilities, whether natural or situational, and design for that kind of target audience. When I've spoken about this in the past, a lot of people have said, but my app is already live. We already have a couple of million users. What do we do now? We can't scale back. But sidewalks were already built, right? Our entire cities were built and all sidewalks were already laid down, stone foundations. But when the world started becoming more and more aware about designing for inclusivity, all we had to do was make one cut. That was it. It didn't ruin the experience for normal users, but it made it much more accessible for wheelchair users. And because of, I spoke about how it's not just accessibility, even for parents who are wheeling along a small child in a pram, or for people who have bags with wheels on them, this is a blessing. You're designing for one type of accessibility user, but you're ending up with an inclusive design for people who have permanent disabilities like wheelchair users, and for situational ones like trolley or bag users. Okay, at this point, you're probably thinking, I don't do sidewalks, I don't do pavements, right? How does this apply to software? How many of you use Medium? Medium, okay. Medium is probably, I think, the most popular blogging platform out there, right? You can sign up, write articles, people read it. It's really great if you don't want to go through the process of setting up your own blog. What Medium did is it noticed that a lot of its users wouldn't have the best of data connectivity. It wouldn't be perfect. And a lot of these articles and blogs that people write, they tend to include large, high-resolution images to get the point across. Now, Medium, didn't have to reinvent the wheel. All they did was show a scaled-down version of the image on the initial load. Now, how this helps is that a lot of websites, if you look at them when they haven't loaded anything, there's either a white space there or the content hasn't made space for the image yet. So one of two things happens. Users end up looking at a blank space in the web page, or the content starts jumping around once the image is loaded. Medium solved all that just by loading a scaled down image of the high resolution image, and the entire processing is done on the server side. So through this simple fix, they made their website much more inclusive for users who had poor network connections or even substandard network connections. One idea that a concept app is doing right now. How many of you use a floating action button in your app? That circular button. Most apps do, right? Most apps these days have a floating action button because it is one of material design's most forthcoming, and it's like its highlighted component, right? It's almost becomes synonymous with material design. And to us, who we're using it in so many apps, it's very obvious that that button is meant to indicate and add an action, right? But if your user isn't very familiar with these design patterns, whether it's because they're coming from a different platform or from a different technological background, it's not going to be very obvious to them. How do you fix it? Well, this app is called Selene. It's an open source app on GitHub. What it does is, on the initial few times the app loads, it gives like a 15 or 20-second window for the user to begin interacting with the app. If Selene notices that the user isn't sure what to do, it morphs that floating action button into a text button, which has a very obvious label telling the user that this is to add a new note. A really simple interaction that probably takes half an hour, 45 minutes to code, but it makes users' lives much easier, because if you look at a sample situation where a user comes onto your app and they don't know what to do first, there's a very high likelihood that they're going to end up dropping off and probably then go download a competitor's app because it showed them how to get started. Deploying a simple fix like this is more inclusive towards the type of users that might come onto your platform, and it helps further the idea that design has to be inclusive to all types of users. Okay, a very basic overview of the principles that are included in inclusive design. Recognize exclusion. I think it's probably the most important. Normally, when we design products in our environments, our own biases, our own experiences, they tend to influence those designs. Coming back to the example of that button, to everyone who's attended Droidcon in the past couple of days, that is going to be a very obvious thing. Like when you start building a product, you're going to think, okay, this floating action button, I can use it for an add action. Everyone knows what it does. That's great, I'll go ahead and add it. It's very obvious to us, but in reality what is happening is that our personal bias, that it's obvious, that bias is influencing the product decision. It's influencing the fact that this button is easy for everyone to use. In reality, it might not be. So recognizing that we have that bias, and that by default we're excluding a large number of users, or whether they have disabilities or contextual conditions, recognizing that bias is probably the most important step towards inclusive design. Because once you know something is wrong, then it becomes much easier to fix. Learn from diversity. Now, if you think that, say you have the door example that I spoke about earlier, right? If you, as an engineer, if you try to come up with solutions that you think users might do in such situations, for example, say your app doesn't support a native language, right? And you expect users to immediately open the language switcher from the default screen. That is also your bias influencing it, because you are assuming what the user will do if faced with adversity. But humans have evolved and have lived on Earth for so long that overcoming adversity is probably one of our strongest qualities, right? People have lived through savagery in the early days of human beings, animal attacks, war. We've lived through everything. and human beings have still found a way to adapt and to survive. If you make your design decisions based on your personal bias, by you thinking what the user might do if faced with adversity, you're probably going to end up making a wrong decision. The ideal way to do it is to learn from those users. Give them a sample scenario where they're faced with a less than optimal experience. See how they evolve and how they adapt to that bad experience. Learning from that insight, seeing how they adapt to it, that is your key to coming up with a solution for your problem, not a theoretical answer that you think might solve it. Solve once and extend. Like we spoke about the one-handed thing, right? If you think about it from a theoretical perspective, you're just making a product easier for one-handed people to use. And the same for the sidewalk. If the original cuts were made in the sidewalk just for wheelchair users, right? But because people started expanding on that thinking, solving for one problem and then expanding it, it ended up becoming useful for much more types of users, right? The same one-handed thing could be influenced by a person who has an injury in one hand or a person whose one hand is occupied. The same sidewalk proved useful to baggage owners and to mothers carrying children in trolleys. So think once, target one problem, and then expand it to an immediate set of users around it. At this point, you're asking, why do it? Right? And this is probably the most obvious question that I get. Why should I begin doing inclusive design? My product works, everything is fine, users are using it. Even if they're having the difficulty using it, my ratings are high, my daily active users are climbing. Why should I waste development efforts and time and money in doing something that will probably have very little gain? If we had if we had this approach towards all problems that affected humanity, we wouldn't have come so far. At some point, things become, and this is a very philosophical topic to talk about in a Droidcon thing, but at some point it becomes our moral responsibility to make the world a more welcoming place for all types of users, right? There's a probably one of the most common games out there on Steam called Rust. Millions of users worldwide. They decided to do a random experiment where instead of letting users customize their playable character, they decided to randomize its appearance. It resulted in a lot of people who were perhaps men, white men, being given colored characters, women being given men characters, men being given women characters. It was out of their control. It was just how the game presented it to them. Within the first couple of weeks, the ratings fell so terribly, and it showed that obvious bias that people don't like to be in adversity. I think that is one of the ways you can explain it to yourself, that if you think that, I don't understand how these users are feeling for my product, think of it that way. Think if you open a form on a website and it doesn't include your type of gender or your ethnicity, what do? You click on others? Yes, that's the only option left. But it's a suboptimal experience. You feel excluded from the majority of people. You feel like they have groups and I'm left out. And these are how most of the users who are behind this curtain of exclusivity, this is how they feel. Because these products aren't very usable for them. And while they may seem obvious for the rest of us, it's a real difficulty in their lives. It's something they go through every day using our products. And if we were to, for maybe, it doesn't have to be a complete rewrite or 100% coverage, but even if we were to start taking small steps towards making our products inclusive, towards making it easier for all types of users to use, the world would gradually become a more welcoming, a more friendly, and a more open place for all types of users. A few tips before I reach a conclusion. Involve code early. A lot of us are scared of this, and we don't want to write code in the beginning until all the requirements are in place and all the designs are complete. But if you involve your code early, you know what actually translates. I don't know how many of you attended Taylor's talk yesterday, but a lot of design things are lost in translation. But if you involve code early, like you know that there is going to be a login screen in your product, and even if the requirements aren't met, you could spend that time developing it for inclusivity. Another important practice is that when you build a few components, like say you build a login screen module, and it's completely inclusive, it's really important to maintain it as a sort of library which you can reuse across projects. Because once you've designed one module to be inclusive and you start reusing it, every product, if you do that for one module, it's going to have a cascading effect. And maybe a couple of years down the line, your products are completely inclusive for all types of users. Respect patterns. A lot of product teams, designers, developers, they think that they have to innovate with interfaces. But it's your content that has to be fresh and radical, not your patterns. You don't have to come up with a completely new way to navigate a platform. You don't have to come up with a new type of text field. All this is there. Don't waste your time and create a bad experience in the process by trying to reinvent patterns that have already been established, by trying to create patterns that users aren't familiar with. Instead, focus on your content. Let that shine through. Let that set you apart from every other app that is offering the same experience. Don't be exact. Um, Again, a lot of developers are familiar with how some things are hard-coded. Translating that into design, maybe something like I spoke about the music player earlier. The play button had to work with that exact animation. It was coded into the app, the really pretty animation that most of us fell in love with. But that was all. It was exact. It had no way to adapt to a lesser scenario. If even using something like the isLowRam device API call, something as simple as that can help us adapt our product and our animations in this case to be more inclusive to users who have lower end devices. Enforce simplicity. This is pretty self-explanatory, but when you're designing a product or an interface, don't try to make things very complex. Don't put more information that the user can, more than they can experience, because even if it seems that, for the average user, they can digest X amount of information, for a person with disabilities, it's going to be even more difficult. Their normal isn't our normal. So try, instead of, when you reach the X amount of information, instead of thinking of squeezing in a little more, by saying that this is an acceptable amount, try going below the margin. Because if you see that acceptable amount, there aren't superhumans who are smarter than that amount. But there are people who are less capable of digesting that information. So set the bar of how much information people can digest, keep that simplicity, and enforce it across your entire products. That is all. So I know this is like a very hands-off, a very theoretical topic, not something you can go home and implement. No obvious takeaways. Unlike most Droidcon talks, right? They teach you something that you can go, you can try it out in your code, and you'll have immediate results. But this is something that needs to be spoken about, because, like I said, diversity is becoming more and more important. We need to make the world a more welcoming and inclusive place. And even if this talk serves the basic purpose of getting your thought process started in this direction, then it has been a success, because it shows that at least these many people more are thinking about it. Right now, there are very few people thinking in this direction, and every new mind who gets influenced by this idea that we have to be more inclusive, maybe the results aren't obvious, but a few years down the line, we're going to have products influenced by such people like you guys, and those are going to be more inclusive for all types of users. That's all. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, be free to take anything.